away we go. Do a share, sharing the PowerPoint. All right, so good morning. So we'll see how we do on this 2-module day. This one is short and sweet with a decent lab at the end of it. The next one is rather large, so we'll see how we do with 15. And this module is basic troubleshooting of SQL Server. We'll talk about well, an overall methodology. So this chapter is a little bit philosophical, right? What makes a good troubleshooter? There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Since SQL Server is an application, right? It means it's code. It's very dynamic. It has to respond to different events. It has to interact with items within SQL Server itself. It has to interact with the operating system. It has to do networking. So there can be a variety of things that aren't functioning. And one of the examples are service related. Everything's in place and you say go, and it's not going. And if you recall, services will have a chain of dependencies sometimes too. So the main service might fire up and it needs a secondary service, which needs a tertiary service, which needs a quaternary service, and 5 levels down the chain, the thing isn't running because this little piece at the end didn't fire up. And as you're aware, right, connectivity, network troubleshooting 101, connecting to your database, connecting to any computer becomes an issue. So there's conversations on that. The author mentions later on, he'll say, oh, if you can't connect over the network, then try a shared memory connection. And you will say, what? Because we didn't do anything with those. So I emailed you all a hyperlink to an article online that discusses the 3 ways you can actually connect to your SQL Server instance, right? The normal way we do is through TCP/IP, right? So we just remote and connect to it. One of the other ways is a named pipe. And the third way is this shared memory thing. So I put an article on that. If you're using shared memory, you're typically trying to connect to your instance using the SQL command line to figure out what's going on. So I shared that to maybe illuminate that topic. So we're gonna have a conversation about characteristics of good troubleshooters. And then when you are troubleshooting, the key thing is to have some kind of a plan. If you are systematic, right? If you have steps you usually follow, right? If you can't connect to something, then you double check and see what your IP address is, and the first thing you check is to say, well, I can't connect to it because something's wrong at basic networking. You have a plan, so you roll it out. So they're saying applying some kind of methodology. Plans and structures and methodologies are good because things never break down at a convenient time. Well, sometimes it's less critical than others, but often something's not working and it's crucial and it's the middle of the business day, or something stops working in the middle of the night and you're woken out of bed at 3 a.m. groggy. You have a methodology for troubleshooting. You can just fall into your usual routine and hopefully determine what the problem is. Okay, so let's try to have a conversation. So I will express my opinions, and if anybody wants to jump in about troubleshooting and characteristics. So first point here, what characteristics have you observed in people who you consider to be good troubleshooters? So the first thing, cool as a cucumber. If something's going sideways, it's not going to do the troubleshooter any good if they're freaking out. So just embracing the problem, being calm. Being diligent, being stubborn. Some people, when they try to troubleshoot, they try a couple things and they get frustrated and that's it. Other people will be like a dog on a bone and just keep digging at it until they find the problem. Sometimes, not always, sometimes the best troubleshooters are people with a lot of experience because they'll have a larger reservoir of experience and knowledge to draw from to say, oh, wait a minute. Best troubleshooters are people who do troubleshooting a lot. If you've been fixing a particular problem, for example, something would happen at the campus and I would have fixed it and then it happens again. I'll say, wait a minute, this looks familiar. So somebody who does a lot of troubleshooting makes a good troubleshooter. Also things such as creativity. Being able to look at a situation and say, okay, it's not this, it's not that. what are the other possibilities? So like, lateral thinking, agile thinking. Poor troubleshooters, all the opposite of what I just said. So people that are one and done, people that freak out, people that don't have any patience, people who give up too easy. And of course, troubleshooters, so I guess it's a double-edged sword. If you're doing a lot of troubleshooting, you gather a lot of experience. If you are overwhelmed and have to do too much troubleshooting, then it can go the other way, where you just basically are overburdened and overwhelmed with it. Any group opinions upon good troubleshooting characteristics or poor ones? Nope. Alrighty then.
No, sorry.
Well, what else are you going to add to that list, right? I just kind of threw a bucket of everything there. So methodology. So any kind of a method or plan is better than none at all. So there's some fairly standard zones or phases or stages that you can use. If you go to various organizations, they will have their different strategies. If you remember from way back in A+, I know I didn't teach you A+, but I think I know what book you used. And there was probably a 7-step troubleshooting methodology for how, I don't know, Larry, the tech guy that, first showed up dressed in jeans and afterwards, wore a nice polo shirt. Some other organizations, right, will have a 5-step methodology, but it all boils down to, gathering data. So investigate, find out what's happening, right? What the circumstances are, exactly what isn't working, right? What is working. If somebody says something such as, so we're talking SQL here, right? I can't connect to my SQL server. All right, well, what SQL server is it? Where are you? Do you mean you can't connect to it locally? You can't log on to it? Do you mean you can't connect to it remotely? So you kind of gather the scope and the nature of the problem, and that'll direct you on the path of the things to troubleshoot. Once you know the scope and you've investigated, then you analyze. So, all right, what you're telling me is that you can't connect to it remotely, but you can log in locally. Well, that tells me that's a networking problem. So that we double check to see if there's any connectivity issues, and you start doing network troubleshooting 101. If you find multiple possibilities, right, then you should, well, it's 2 ways you can go with this. You can go with a problem that seems to have been popping up a lot. So even though it might not be the most probable one because it's fairly complex, if you've noticed that the other 3 SQL guys have actually had the exact same problem, then you say, maybe it's this again. If you have problems that are highly complex and ones that are really simple, then you would tend to go for the low-hanging fruit and try to test the simple ones first. So you wouldn't necessarily assume that somebody had suddenly changed the firewall and made some complex firewall rule, and that's why you can't connect. You might first assume that, okay, just let me go and check to see if this thing has the proper IP address or not. And once you've investigated and you've got your usual suspects, your possible suspects, then you need to record them and basically tick them off in an organized fashion. If there's a dozen possible things, right, it's really important to keep track of what you've tested and what you haven't tested. And it's also important, if you start implementing the fixes and changes, that you do so in an orderly fashion. If you go and change the firewall and then change an IP address and then change another setting, so you suddenly tweaked 3 or 4 different variables and then it starts working, well, which one did it? You effectively have to go back and undo 3 of the changes. So you need to avoid shotgunning and scattershotting your solutions and try to do them one at a time systematically. And once you've deployed or implemented the solution, they need to double check and make sure it works, right? So try now, can you connect it? Yes, I can. All right, I found your problem. Somebody had changed the DHCP server and suddenly you got a different IP address on a different subnet. So the problem wasn't your SQL server, it was in fact a networking problem. You validate it and then do the paperwork at the end. Document what the solution is so that the next time it happens, you, or if it's somebody else that has to solve the problem, can draw upon that experience to get a quicker solution. So services. Services have dependencies. Communicating data over the network, many services involved. Accessing database files, there's many services involved. As I said before, you start up SQL, you start up any program, the GUI's there, everything's running, you can see stuff, you can click, but things aren't starting up and stuff isn't running. It's not apparent on the interface what's going on. It's some service maybe 7 layers deep that isn't firing up. And then why isn't it firing up? And when I get to the demo, and part of this conversation is that, yes, there are error logs you can dig into, both the error logs that SQL Server itself will store and the good old Windows event logs that are there as well. And then a little demo about troubleshooting. I had to manually rework this demo because when I first tried to do it, it didn't fail. And I'm like, what? So I don't know if the setup command was wrong, but I had to go in and break it before I could fix it. So I'll show you that demo when we get there. So if you think it's service related, especially if you try to access something and it tells you service X isn't running, and then you jump to the service manager and you try to fire up the service and it tells you, sorry, couldn't start the service, well then, aha, it is service related. And you can start digging into the logs to see if there's any kind of crumbs of information that'll lead you to the ultimate problem. If SQL Server starts up, but it can't be connected to, then it could be a network related issue, right? Again, if you can't get the GUI to fire up, maybe you can access SQL Server from some other resource. So if you can get to it from the command line with SQL command, then you know your database is there. So now you know it has something to do with the application and connectivity. If you have, again, this is one of the conversations about try to see if you can get to it through shared memory. You can read the link I sent you. So can't get to it over the network, so TCP is a problem. I don't have named pipes implemented, so that's not an option, but shared memory is always there. Let me fire up my SQL command line interface. Let me see if I can connect by a shared memory. Aha, I can get to it. All right, it's running. Obviously, networking is an issue, so I'm going to go troubleshoot my networking. If SQL Server won't start, then there's a few possibilities. Recall that if the master database, that is the top database that holds all the metadata or the management information, if that's corrupt or not available, then SQL Server won't even start. So that's a possibility. And there's a whole chain of other dependencies that might be keeping the SQL Server from even firing up. Won't start. Let me check the Windows system log, because SQL Server is an application. So therefore, if an application won't start, there may be information there about it. If you suspect it has something to do with services, then maybe there's a clue inside the system log. Also, of course, check the SQL Server error log itself to see if that gives you any data. And as I mentioned before, maybe the master database, maybe the model databases have been corrupted. The temp database, even though it doesn't contain any crucial information that needs to be there, it's a scratch pad that everybody puts temporary stuff into. If there's nowhere to put temporary stuff into it, then again, SQL Server won't fire up. And if you can identify what service won't fire up, then you can try to start it from the command prompt or start it from the services GUI. And in a minute, we're going to see the SQL Service Server Manager interface that you can make use of. So the server error log, right? It's just a text file with a bunch of text entries. You can open it up in something like Notepad and take a look at it. So you can read through that. If you recall the behavior of logs, once a log file reaches a maximum length, it kind of gets archived, error log 2, then it makes a fresh error log. So you typically, when you're looking at error logs, you go and find the one that just has the normal error log name, and the other ones that are there are previous copies. And that error log will keep growing. And the latest and greatest errors will be tagged onto the very end of the log. So if you're troubleshooting something that's just gone south, you open that up and you go to the bottom and saying, okay, what is it telling me? Hopefully something. So by default, the current log and multiple copies, 6 copies of the most recent log files are retained. You can use log file viewer, but again, if the GUI can't fire up and you can't use any of the funky tools in the SQL Server Management Studio, then you got to use something basic. So pull up a text editor like Notepad and see what you got. And then look at the available log files. And if the problem, so say the problem knocked off the HR database, and for some reason HR wasn't doing anything for like a day. And then the next day they come in and they say, hey, we can't get access to the database. The problem might not show up in the current data log. It might actually show up in one of the historical ones. So you might have to open up error log 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 until you find something that gives you some kind of error information that relates to the database or the problem that you're troubleshooting. Windows Event Viewer, you can jump into the system log to look at Windows related items. And like I said, the application log, SQL Server is an app. You can look in there to see if there's any application level information that gives you a hint. So let me do this demo. Got my things running. I'll remember to switch over. Okay, I'm recording. Go figure. For a moment there, I thought I forgot. Okay, once I get this opened, and I get like, so I'll start it once I get logged into here. Yeah, I'll shut that down. It gives too much away. Studio. All right, new share. Okay, there's my SQL machine. It's over a little bit. All right, I've ran my setup, I believe. I guess we'll find out the hard way if I didn't. And we have, so there's a variety of tools that are around here. So if you do a search for Configuration Manager, you will find the Config Manager. It digs in deep to a variety of items, right? So in specific here, we have SQL Server Services, some native clients, some network config. So this demo, we were trying to connect to SQL 2 and we couldn't connect to it. So we said, maybe it's not up and running. So we went in here to the service list and lo and behold, SQL Server 2 service is stopped. So we can do a right click and a start. And if I've broken this correctly, it'll fail. And the fact that it's taking a while to start is a good indication that it's going to fail. All right, so it didn't work. So let's go take a peek, just using the built-in Windows Event Viewer to see if this thing had logged something useful for us. Okay, aha. Lo and behold, we got lucky, we hit pay dirt. We have an error at the top, has to do with service control. And if you look down here, we notice it has something to do with MIA SQL, so that looks like it's ours. Remember with this, you get sort of like a general description, but you can dig into the details, and it's going to tell you things such as, okay, with SQL Server 2, right, the event was a 17113. So if we're lucky, that same number is going to be meaningful, and it's going to possibly be found in a log somewhere, where you got some binary data. So it didn't give us a lot. How about in system here? Service Control Manager, event ID, task level, system time, adventure works, parameter that. So didn't give us much, but this will help us dig in, and we're going to see if we can find that data inside of our SQL Server log, right, as opposed to just in the event viewer. So where is this stuff? We got to go hunting for it. It's down inside the guts of where the program lives. Program files, Microsoft SQL Server. Yeah, I usually click the wrong one in here because there's two that look the same. It is this one. So we're digging into this one for SQL 2. Yes, more SQL. Thank you very much. Logs. All right, let's look at the logs. Here's the logs, 5:36. Okay, I know we're in the wrong time zone. That looks like the current one. We'll right click, open with, we'll say Notepad, we'll say Oakley Dokley. And we'll scroll down to the bottom where we are. There's that error 17113 that we saw back in the event viewer. There's more information. Oh, wait, cannot find the file. Let's scroll over. What the heck can it file? Can't find blah, 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 blah. Can't find the master database file. Well, okay. A couple slides ago, the slide maker said, hey, if that's broken or corrupted, then the SQL Server instance won't start. So that service isn't starting because it can't find the master database. So then you say, all right, is it supposed to be here? Let's go look to see if it's there. See if I can find it. And we go into data. So here's a bunch of the underlying files. And we look here and we see something called master. But it's not named .mdf, it's named .av0001. So in this simulation, the idea here is that for some reason your antivirus program tagged your master database file as being suspicious. So it quarantined it and renamed it. So that's why the service won't start, because there is no such thing as master MDF anymore. Your freaking antivirus program touched it. Now, we're going to rename it, we'll get the service back and running, but you still have a bigger problem that we're not going to solve today, but it's to figure out why the heck is your antivirus renaming your master database file. So this will get it back up and running. I'll show in a bit. Have to go back and start the service up. But as a secondary issue, everybody can get back to work, and you got to figure out what the heck just happened. Why did the antivirus nuke this? So now if we go back to this, theoretically, it'll start. Bam. Okay, so couldn't get to SQL 2, service wasn't running, tried to start it, failed, went to the event viewer, found some details, went to the SQL log, found even more details, pointed us to the file, did a rename, right, and away we went. New share. PowerPoint. Okay, besides services, the other top contenders will be just connectivity issues, cannot connect, remotely. And then the other possibility could be login failures. So somebody's credentials just aren't working. Recall that with SQL, we have two sources for credentials: locally defined user identities that live inside the SQL database itself, and then those things that exist in Active Directory. So there's two spots that could have went sideways. One, if it's a local user, maybe they've been disabled or changed or deleted. Quite often it's user error too, right? Can't log in, why? Oh, you're using the wrong password. And the other possibility would be something changed in Active Directory if it's pulling credentials from there, or if for some reason the domain controller isn't reachable, then the login can't handshake with the domain controller to double check the person's credentials. So there's a variety of things that can go sideways with login. Here's where the shared memory conversation comes up. So if you can't connect to the server via TCP/IP, then if you didn't want to just go and jump into networking 101 and troubleshoot TCP/IP issues, if you want to just prove the fact that the SQL server is still running and you can talk to it locally, you could use shared memory. That being said, shared memory only works when you're on the same physical box that the SQL Server instance is running. So you can't check shared memory from file server 47 to see if you can remote. Shared memory is not a remote access. It is just is the database engine actually running, yes or no? If there's no shared memory access, then you could troubleshoot the service, as we just kind of did. Oh, service isn't up, database isn't running. Let me see if I can get it going. There is a possibility that if the service is running, if there's no access by shared memory, maybe the credentials are an issue, because from the command line, you still need to authenticate. So if you can't authenticate, then maybe it's a login issue. And then you say, okay, you might not do the shared memory first because that's weird. You might start off at the test network connectivity, right? Can the server name be resolved, right, by name? So the whole, can I ping it by its IP address, or can I ping it by MIA-SQL, right? Networking 101. Can the network and the server be reached? So can I try to establish a connection to it? Can I use remote desktop protocol to do a remote connection to the entire server? So forget about can I remote and get to the SQL GUI. Can I use remote desktop and get to the actual physical server? If it can't be resolved by name, then you probably have DNS issues. Or if you can't get to it by name or IP address, if you can't ping it by IP address, then you have the server could be totally down, or you could be on wrong subnets. Is the client trying to connect using the proper network interface? So are they going to the right target? Are they using TCP/IP? If they're trying to use named pipes and you haven't deployed named pipes as a connectivity option, then that won't work. If remoting doesn't work, right, especially remote desktop, then maybe the firewall of the server has been changed. Somebody changed the firewall. It says, nope, no longer accept remote connections. And now nobody can remote either to the box or to the SQL instance. Is the client using right protocols and settings? So part of the connectivity, remoting, right, we'll be using defaults, using fixed ports, etc. So if somebody has changed the default ports, right, they're not using fixed ports. If they're using something dynamic, well, now you're trying to hit a moving target. So that could be the issue. If you have set up aliases for the instances that you're trying to target. So maybe the HR guys got to this database that had a long-winded name, and you made an alias called HR database for them. Well, if somebody's changed that, then users can no longer get to it through the convenient alias name. And then is the firewall blocking connectivity? So I kind of mentioned firewall before, but that is one of our standard suspects. So I already mentioned this. If it's a Windows-based login, is the domain controller available? If you can't handshake with the domain controller, you might not be able to log on. Now, if you recall your server 2012 and domain activities and Active Directory, usually once you've logged on, your credentials are locally cached. So if you are a user that's already logged in using your Windows credentials, you'll still be good to go, even if the DC isn't available. But if you are a brand new user who has never logged into that box before, if your credentials haven't been cached, then you'll definitely be snookered because the authentication can't reach out and check the domain controller. SQL Server logins. So remember, mixed mode means that you can have locally defined users and domain controller based users. If somebody's gone in and changed it out of mixed mode to Windows only, then none of your local users can log in. So that's a quick way to break it for everybody. Is the password wrong? And has somebody or something failed so many times that the account is locally locked out? And perhaps there is a password change requirement that's popped up. So you actually can't connect to it until you respond to the password change. Probably 2 times out of 10 with business students when they first start at Willis. Everybody starts with a default password, and the first thing that happens when they log in is they get a challenge that says, okay, you must change your password. And because the screen kind of looks like an error situation, that a couple of business students will say, I can't log in. And the reason they can't log in is that they're not actually reading the screen in front of them that says, please give me a new password. They assume that's a failure. Right. Various principles, right? So login identities need to have proper permissions to actually be allowed to connect to SQL Server instances. So maybe the permissions got changed and that particular identity doesn't have connect permission. Maybe it's a brand new user and when it was configured, the person forgot to give that. And is the default database that's associated with that login, is it actually available and do they have access permissions? So if they log in and the database is down, right, they're going to get no interaction. Okay, short and sweet. So please jump into the lab. I'm going to pause the video recording. And I would, as always, be hanging around here to assist with the labs. Actually, this is one module I'm going to